views, opinions, and positions expressed on this radio program are those of the speakers, authors, or other contributors. This broadcast is intended for entertainment purposes only.
Consciousness is an amorphous and expanding entity.
Realize that you are in a cultural hypnosis.
We have been systematically put into a state of unconsciousness so that we cannot see.
I don't want to rule on Jew, Gentile, black man, white. We all want to help one another. Human beings are like
what we are part of and what we are experiencing, though, that is changing.
When one is able to repeatedly step into the purity and hardened space of genuine and heightened awareness, miracles manifest. Conscious evolution becomes inevitable, and the revelations to one's spirit becomes revolutionary within the simplicity of its own essence. Awakening then becomes of it to where the destination of such a path, when one has answered to the calling, unfolds to reveal the ripening of one's universal truths. The book of positive light, remembrance of the heart.
And now, here is your host for Quantum Mindfulness Radio, Joel Ayala Ayupanya.
Okay, welcome back to another intriguing episode of Quantum Mindfulness Radio. I am your host, Joel Ayala Ayupana, and we have a returning guest for us tonight. And I had the pleasure and the luxury of conversing with him many years ago when I was with BBS Radio. But now, and my new platform with realrevolutionradio.com, he is coming back. Last time we spoke about his book. He is an author. He is a systems analyst and a experimental philosopher. And he is the author of his wonderful and intriguing book called Asleep in the Helix, Survival and the Science of Self-Realization. Welcome back to the show.
Hey, thanks, Joel. Thanks for having me.
And yes, and I apologize. His name is M.A. Carrano. M.A. Carrano, the author of Asleep in the Helix. Now, Mike.
You know, if it makes it easier, you can just call me Mike.
Okay.
That's just basically a pen name that I advertise myself through.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
Absolutely. And Mike, if you could just describe your book just real briefly. And I know your book in itself is a marvelous book. It's an extraordinary book.
Thanks, I appreciate that.
Yeah, a great read. If you're really into quantum theory and many aspects of quantum mechanics, it is definitely a book that you should explore. But we're going to be talking about something a little bit different, especially most important during these times. And we're going to be speaking about the existence of God. And Mike, if you can go and just briefly explain your book, and then how we can basically use those concepts in order to explain the existence of God, but also take it to the next level and how we can do that.
Okay. So people know just a little bit of preliminary information. I'm an experimental philosopher. I'm a systems theorist. And basically a systems theory that I'm developing is something called Meta-noetics. We can get into that in a little bit. But the text that I've authored is called Asleep in the Helix, Survival and the Science of Self-Realization. And what it specializes in is that it's a holistic investigation into the scientific interface of where science and spirituality converge. And it extrapolates on the principles that human beings can be utilizing from that interface so they could help to realize their highest human potential, if it's going to be physical, or if it's going to be mental, or if it's going to be social. It moves up Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and it thoroughly investigates each individual need and extrapolates all the individual biological requisites and psychological requisites that human beings need to be satisfying in order to have those needs optimally fulfilled.
Now, just your vernacular and how you had written this book, it's definitely at another level of understanding. Now, just knowing you and understanding you from the many years that I've known you, you're a strong proponent of meditation, and many aspects of in that world of of knowledge and wisdom. Can you tell the listeners or describe your meditative process and how it has basically incorporated or actually
I can do that.
Brought you to the next level as far as bringing all of that knowledge and wisdom into this particular book?
Sure. Okay. So I'm a transtheist and I'm an omnist. And what a transtheist and an omnist means is that they believe in God, but they believe that all human concepts of God fall woefully short of the actual reality of the divinity that is. And the omnist is an individual who subscribes to the perennial foundation of spiritual truths that constellate all the world's religions in common. And they believe that all different religions are just different cultural manifestations of the same timeless, eternal religion. That's what an omnist is, at least in the sense of the major religious traditions. Obviously, there are certain traditions which I take issue with, such as Mormonism and Scientology. Sorry to my Mormon friends, but this is really the case. There's a lot of evidence against those faiths. But I'm an omnist and I'm a transtheist. Now, my background has gone from a practice of being raised as a Christian, moving to Islam. I've practiced Baha'i, but the most important types of spiritual practice I've taken come from the esoteric aspects of Islam, along with the esoteric aspects of Vedanta, which is a segment of Hinduism, along with the Dharmic traditions of Buddhism. So the practice that I use is it's a syncresis of all these things. So summarize it, I pray 5 times a day in the Sufi tradition, and my meditative practice is very deep and is very rigorous and is very thorough. I sequence into an Islamic meditation, into a Christian meditation, into a Jewish Kabbalistic meditation, backwards into a Zen meditation, and then finish with a Hindu meditation. And I punctuate them with different types of prayer practices from each tradition, prayers selected to avoid concepts of idolatry and to make them maximally monotheistic. And the prayers also being selected so that they're complementary with each other, not contradictory with one another. And using that backwards progress, I'm able to more rapidly accelerate into altered states of consciousness. So that's really the foundation of my religious practice. I study all the world's religions thoroughly and vociferously, and I'm really, really sort of vocal about speaking out about what I've learned.
Now, to get to this level of spirituality, this level of connectedness to spirit, the universe, or to God, however you may frame it, do you have to get to this level where it's more of a holistic type of practice? So what I'm trying to lead at, and the question is this, we talked about this last time with Meta-noetics, and that was something that I wasn't too keen into. So if you could describe Meta-noetics, and I think we can actually open the doorways to the actual answer from that question.
Sure. Okay, so the first thing that we probably need to discuss is a history lesson that really describes the origin of my methodology. So let's just teleport back in time to the 18th century. That's when the Prussian genius Immanuel Kant, he completed his seminal work. It's called Critique of Pure Reason. Now, Kant's critique was significant in the history of Western intellectualism, and it was in a pivotal way because what he was really interested in was investigating the limits of rationality. And he was really the first academic who was interested in that concept because Kant wanted to know not only what human beings can know, but he also wanted to map out what exactly human beings can't know. Now, let's just basically take a detour through hyperspace. Let's go back to the 20th century for a split second, and that's where we can meet another genius. He was a Japanese philosopher. His name's Hajime Tanabe. You probably remember me mentioning him the last time we conversed. But Tanabe, he's significant to us because he's really the first to coin the term meta-noetics, and he did it by synthesizing the Greek term meta, which means knowledge or beyond. Or sorry, not knowledge or beyond. It just simply means beyond, and he did that by combining it with the root, which nous, which itself means knowledge. So, like Kant before him, Tanabe's goal was to explore the limits of rationality. But dissimilar from Kant, he wanted to go beyond reason to determine whether or not other forms of knowledge are possible once we transcend the limits of rational notions of reason, or traditional notions of reason. I should basically say, because that's kind of a redundancy. But his work, it's important to understand, and it's important to understand at least the origin of my perspective. Because at around the time that I was finishing my manuscript, that's for Asleep in the Helix, it was then that I was in an altered state of consciousness, and I experienced something while meditating that it was an entirely new conception of my philosophy, and it occurred to me in a total seamless image. The entire thing came to me finished, and that's really when I decided to call it the philosophy of metanoetics. And what's peculiar here is that I had absolutely no idea, really under God, who Tanabe was at the time, and I didn't know about Tanabe until a friend of mine kind of clued me in, and he brought it to my attention. So after taking his advice, I began doing some preliminary background research into his idea, and what I discovered was that there was really a deep synchronicity between Tanabe's ideas and my own. And since that moment, I've kind of been writing in the spirit of that moment by citing Tanabe as having posthumously named my philosophy. So when it comes to articulating that experience, in the past I've used memes. I've taken them from the Kabbalists, and other instances I've described the experience using the jargon of the Vedantists or the Neo-Gnostics. Depending on who my audience is, I like to describe the experience in different ways, depending on how I feel like going about broaching the topic. But for the moment, I think it would make sense, or at least make it interesting, if I resort to the mystical terminology of Sufis, and that way I could articulate the experience, because Sufis have a tradition of describing the ascent of the spirit, which they call the ruh, during a state of meditation, which they call muraqabah, until it merges into the highest spiritual plane of consciousness, which they call jannah, which the Sufis call the imaginal realm of the seven heavens. And the Sufis teach that it's in precisely that state that the soul communes with al-haq, which means the truth in Arabic, to experience a state which is called murabata, which can only be described as a kind of sublimation of the spirit into the radiance of the divine, if you wanted to call it that. So Sufis teach that what I underwent was really, it was exactly like that. They say it's a class of transpersonal experience. It's comparable to those undergone by the Prophet Muhammad, but not quite in quality or an extent. Just it's a touch of the quality. And they call this experience fitra, which is Arabic for the ultimate nature of the soul. And it's this glimpse of the ultimate nature of the soul that I'm working to express through metanoetics. You see, I personally believe that it's critical for me to emphasize that I think it's deeply, deeply insouciant when people do throw terminology around like this without having an adequate understanding of what these terms signify. And the only reason I do this is because I'm deeply committed to the idea that during my muraqabah, I actually did experience myself dissolved into a kind of murabata with al-haq, or God in the form of the truth itself. And that's where I believe this metanoetic methodology came from. I personally believe it was shown to me, not so much as a new religion or anything significant along the lines of that, but more like an inspired wisdom that transcends the limits of science, transcends the religion, it transcends philosophy entirely. So you might be happy to learn that you don't have to undergo a personal ego death to have a metanoetic experience of any kind. And you certainly don't have to tap into what I like to call a kind of quasi-mystical state of quantum superconsciousness to really wrap your head around how metanoetics works. Does that make sense to you?
Absolutely. And it kind of triggered my memory of our conversation from last year. And it was something that we've had on the side. And I remember when you were in deep meditation, you were experiencing angelic beings at another level. I know at this particular level, at the third dimension, we could experience things in a different light. But once you get in the deeper realms of knowing and understanding, it becomes numerical or even sacred geometrical, or even... Yeah,
it does. See, the collective unconscious will communicate to you through archetypes, and it's not like you literally experience a physical angel, but it's more like an inner experience to which certain memes are most effective in interpreting it as. That's the best way to describe it. It's going to communicate to you in the memes that are most acclimated towards your psychology and towards your understanding. And metanoetics is similar to that because it relies on various different types of memes in order to understand it. Namely, a lot of the memes that it draws on come from different mathematical concepts or different physical concepts in the realms of higher dimensional physics. And the concept is fairly simple. I could explain it really brief. You want me to?
Absolutely. Yeah, definitely. Okay. Please do.
So, in essence, it's a methodology that empowers people with the spiritual capacity to think in 4D. It really in a time when the majority of people are stuck thinking either in 2D or even in 3D. So, really, here's why I think this is helpful. People who think in 4D have the power to solve problems that are impossible to people who are trapped thinking about life in terms of 2 or even 3 dimensions. And that's why I believe this 4-dimensional kind of thinking is the key to resolving virtually all the major crises of our age. Now, in the past, when you and I were talking and I introduced spiral dynamics and the idea of the coral V meme, I explained that most people are aware of subjectivity and objectivity, but they're virtually totally oblivious to the idea of adjectivity or any other perspective beyond that, even the perspective of projectivity, with adjectivity being the perspective that sees different types of relationships and projectivity being sort of the qualitative aspect of our experience. And without these, they tend to be confined in their understanding of the world. But I'm positive that a substantial portion of your audience are unfamiliar with my work. So I'll just take a minute, I'll explain how each concepts of subjectivity and objectivity and adjectivity and projectivity relate.
Before you do that, I just want to be able to take little baby steps, and not too further back, but maybe you could describe for our listeners, and even perhaps describe for me for better understanding, third dimension, fourth, fifth dimension. I mean, just really briefly, in layman's term, if you could do that before we get into the more deeper topics.
Okay, no, makes perfect sense. Okay, there's four basic perspectives, and each of these four perspectives are corresponding to four dimensions. And each of these four dimensions, again, they have their own modality of thinking that's best for interfacing between perspectives and dimensions that they're associated with. So, for example, the subjective perspective is the point of view on the first dimension that I call the archetypal continuum. And that's the world of mental phenomena and the cognitive modality that is really best outfitted for mediating between the two I call primal. It's the primal modality. Basically, it's one-dimensional, and it's kind of like a categorical logic. Now, the adjective perspective is the point of view on the third dimension that I call the existential matrix. And that's the world of qualitative relationships that serve as a context for our experiences. So the cognitive modality that, in my opinion, is optimally suited for mediating between the adjective perspective and the existential matrix is what I call holistic cognition, which is really three-dimensional thinking. It's systematic. It's also integral. Then there's the objective perspective of the second dimension, and I call that the chaotic abstract. The chaotic abstract is the world of interdependent parts abstractly reimagined as independent wholes within themselves. And the method of thinking that is best outfitted for interfacing between the objective perspective and the chaotic abstract is, again, it's one I call reductionist. In a nutshell, it's two-dimensional thinking, and it's context-contingent, it's relativistic, and empirically grounded in our observational experience of the world. And last but not least, there's the projective perspective of the fourth dimension that I call the aeonic event. The aeonic event is the realm in which a direct perception of the possibilities themselves is possible, and it's concealed within a chaotic event that exists as purely qualitative reality. An aeonic event. But strangely enough, the cognitive modality that is best equipped for interfacing between the projective perspective and the aeonic event, it's called transcendent. And this four-dimensional mindset, it's transrational, it's deeply intuitive, it's synchronistic, it's also self-reflexive in the sense of being self-conscious. It's really best paralleled with the sense of a direct perception of the innermost reality of a thing. So in metanoetics, in order for an individual to think in four dimensions, then it's not enough to see the world simply from a subjective point of view or even an objective point of view, or to think about the world in even logical and empirical terms. And rather, what they have to do is that in order for them to claim that they know something comprehensively, they have to be able to touch upon all of these bases. So, like I said, they have to touch upon all these bases in order for it to be truly comprehensive. And when they do, the situation demands that we see it completely, and that means through one's own subjective or adjective or objective or projective perspectives. And that way we could approach the event and we could understand how the archetypal continuum or the existential matrix or the chaotic abstract or the aeonic event of the situation, how they conceptually interrelate. And from there we could understand how the primal, the holistic, reductionistic, and transcendent paradigms of thinking contextually unify all of them. And when we do this successfully, when we're thinking in this way successfully, then the quality of our understanding, it's light years beyond what we can normally acquire from through philosophy or the humanities or the sciences or even religion alone. So now you know why I consider most people to be two-dimensional thinkers. And this doesn't just include famous atheists like Sam Harris or Richard Dawkins or Daniel Dennett or Lawrence Krauss. They're all brilliant individuals, or they're geniuses in their field, but again, they're two-dimensional thinkers. Because metanoetically speaking, it's easy to see why they're atheists. Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, and Lawrence Krauss, they're all making the same exact logical fallacy. You see, it's like Abraham Maslow said, if the only tool that you have is a hammer, then you're going to tend to see every problem as a nail. At least I believe he said that. I could probably be wrong, but I'm confident he did.
Right.
Now, the ultimate truth of reality, it's four-dimensional, and because each of them are only capable of thinking in 2D, each of these famous atheists are guilty in trying to reduce the ultimate truth into a sort of a subject-object dichotomy that's conducive to their own limited scope of perception. And this is ultimately impossible, and it's impossible to do without really distorting the concept of God into an irrational characterization of itself, which they in turn mistake for as being fundamentally flawed without ever realizing that it's their own misunderstanding of the phenomena that they're attacking and rejecting, and not really the reality of God. And that's why, in order to prove the existence of God, then the task requires using the right tools for the job. And that means that each of the four dimensions of the phenomena of God must be observed from subjective and adjective and objective and projective perspectives. And these perspectives have to be mediated by their proper cognitive modalities, which are primal, they're holistic, they're reductionistic, and they're transcendent. Because otherwise, if you don't, then like Richard Dawkins or Sam Harris or Daniel Dennett and Lawrence Krauss, you're going to wind up taking the four-dimensional reality of God, distorting it, and compressing it into a two-dimensional mischaracterization of itself. And then you're going to be mistaking your distorted mischaracterization of the event itself for the reality and wind up attacking a straw man. When in reality, the absurdity of the phenomena that you're attacking isn't a commentary on the phenomena itself so much as the inadequacy of a two-dimensional approach to a four-dimensional reality. Does that make sense?
Right. You mentioned the archetypes too. So when you mentioned archetypes in itself, as we experience the many different archetypes as human beings, is that reductionist, or is that more or less something that is a template to understand God, or just the whole grand scheme of the universe?
The concept of archetypes is really sort of it's sort of an adjective interface between a subjective experience and a projective event, which is observed. Well, I could explain that. They're fundamentally mythic in nature, and that's incredibly important to understanding the nature of God and the role that mythology plays in it, because mythology is enormous, and mythology is actually the foundation for our understanding it. And unfortunately, atheists don't really grasp that. They resort to a lot of cliches about the nature of reality, and one of the things they like to repeat is that there's really zero proof for the existence of God. And the problem with statements like that is that they're demonstrably false. There exists explicit proof for the existence of God. The only problem is that atheists on net have a completely false understanding of what exactly the word proof means. In philosophy, the concept of proof has a very specific technical meaning. Now, to prove something means to logically process the data in a way that it demonstrates that the conclusion is necessarily true according to the logical propositions that it accepts as its fundamental premises. So, if I argue that Rex is a mammal because all dogs are mammals and Rex is a dog, then I can just as easily prove the argument true by taking the premises and rearranging them in another way that demonstrates that the conclusion can't be a consequence of manipulating the semantics to confirm my own bias, because the conclusion is directly inferred as the relationship that the truth of the two premises depend on in order for them to be true in the first place. And let me just say it another way. If I make the case that Rex is a mammal because all dogs are mammals and Rex is a dog, then I could just as easily prove my argument true by taking the premises and rearranging them. And I do that in a way that shows the conclusion is generated from the two premises. And all that's necessary in this case for me to do that is to state all dogs are mammals. And since Rex is a dog, then Rex therefore must be a mammal. Now, for atheists and theists alike, the truth of this kind of syllogism, it's usually obvious enough. However, there's a reason that logicians and philosophers like myself consider this kind of argument to be valid for proving propositions. Now, if I tell you that 1 + 2 = 3, then it's also true that 2 + 1 must likewise equal 3. And the reasons are because whether or not you write 3 as 1 + 2 or 2 + 1, the reality is that these formulae are simply different notational forms of the same proposition, which is the number 3. So this is exactly what proof is. A proof isn't scientific evidence the way that most atheists think it is. Again, proof is not scientific evidence the way that most atheists think it is. Proof is a logical assessment of whether or not the conclusion of a philosophical interpretation or an argument is necessarily generated by the premises, or if the conclusions are in a consequence of consequences or their accidents or errors in the process of reasoning about the issue. And this is because when different notational forms are used to express really the same proposition, then it really should be impossible to produce a different conclusion, because the different notational forms are nothing more than ways of writing the same proposition. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Just the traditional scientist, just observing a proof. It's usually tangible. It's usually observable, but it doesn't go into the unseen. And I think the unseen doesn't that go more into the fourth or fifth dimensions of things? Or?
Yeah, no. I just want to correct you real quick. Evidence is tangible and proof. Evidence is tangible and touchable and experiential. Proof is not. People don't know that. Proof is logical. Proof is always a logical function. That's what proof is. It's taking a proposition and writing it in a different notational form to show that the conclusions can't be blamed on an accident in the notational structure, because the conclusions they produce are the same. And that's only possible if the logic notation is itself the same. And here, Joel, here's why this matters. It explains why the different notational forms I use to argue for the existence of God count as proof, because they eliminate the possibility of the conclusions being a consequence of a coincidence or an error of an accident in the logic. Make sense?
Right, definitely. So, in order to understand the existence of God, and again, to bring it down to layman's terms and to basically go through baby steps for an average person who is not a scientist, who is not a researcher, who is not deeply involved with meta-noetics, where do we start off as far as understanding?
Sure. Well, now that we got that out of the way, I think that we could introduce the conceptual foundations that make it possible to understand how it becomes realistic to use logic to prove the existence of God. So let's just start. Now, in order for us to do this, we're going to be adopting a Catholic theologian's definition of God. But it's important to say that the reason we're doing this isn't because we're endorsing Christianity. Instead, the reason why we're using St. Anselm's definition is because his definition of God is generic. In other words, it applies as much to Judaism or Islam or Hinduism and Buddhism as it does to Christianity itself, because each of these traditions agree on St. Anselm's definition. And according to St. Anselm, God could be defined, and this is how he defined God, as a, quote, maximally great being, which none greater is conceivable, end quote. Now, I want to say that again because the definition it's indispensable to the logic we're using. God is a maximally great being, which none greater is conceivable. That's the definition we're using. And according to St. Anselm, he said two very important things about this definition. And the first thing he said is that such a definition establishes God's existence to be self-evident. In other words, it's a self-evident truth. And here's what this means for us. In logic, a proposition is classified as self-evidently true whenever any attempt to deny it inevitably results in a contradiction that falsifies the denial itself, which in turn reveals that the proposition is impossible to deny. It's therefore self-evidently true. It's undeniable, literally.
Okay, Mike. So, before we get deeper into this introductory portion of the proof of God, definitely, I would love for you to inform our listeners your contact information before we go into a commercial break.
Sure. Okay. Just visit www.avatarparadigms.com.
Okay. Well, tonight, ladies and gentlemen, we have a returning guest for you, Mr. M.A. Carrano, the author of Asleep in the Helix, Survival and the Science of Self-Realization, only on Quantum Mindfulness Radio.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Cleveland, we now have liftoff to a higher level of consciousness. Tune in to realrevolutionradio.com, the #1 source for independent music and inspirational podcast radio. Awaken, evolve, inspire, and join the evolution only on realrevolutionradio.com.
In the book, Miriam Prophetess, leader of the Hebrew people, by author Wanda Vassallo, Miriam is doubtless best known as the sister of Moses of the Bible. But there is much more to her story. The 24 verses about her in the Bible reveal some surprising facts about this amazing woman. Micah 6:4 states that Miriam, along with her brothers, Moses and Aaron, are those God appointed to lead the Israelites out of Egypt. In addition to biblical references, rabbinical writing and Jewish folk literature are replete with fascinating stories about her. For example, several references say that Miriam as a young child reprimanded the Pharaoh for having all the Hebrew boy babies killed. That is the way her story begins in this novel, which is based on careful research of the Bible, historical writings and stories that have been handed down through the ages. It ends with Miriam leading the women in triumphant praise and exaltation after the Israelites successfully crossed the Red Sea. Get your copy of In the Book Miriam Prophetess, Leader of the Hebrew People, at major online bookstores such as Amazon.com. Get it today.
Hello, everyone. You are now listening to RealRevolutionRadio.com. My name is Barbara Beach, and I am the scribe of the book called The Living Letters of Mother Mary. And I am the host of a new talk show on Real Revolution Radio called Conversations with Mother Mary. If you would like to check us out, please go to the blog that Mother Mary has. It's lettersfrommothermaryblogspot.com. Thank you for listening and have a great day.
A Quantum Mindfulness Radio production only on RealRevolutionRadio.com. And if you too would love to become a podcaster today, or perhaps even an ad sponsor with our network on RealRevolutionRadio.com, please by all means call us toll free at 844-414-REAL. Again, that is toll free, 844-414-REAL 7325. And find out more about how you too can become an inspiration, a wonderful talk show host on our inspiring and growing podcast radio talk show network. Only here on RealRevolutionRadio.com. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome back to our show, Mr. M.A. Carrano, returning guest. Welcome back, Mike. We're going to be talking about the existence of God, so just continue on from the first segment. You were talking about, in particular, the basics of this particular meme.
Okay, so just to recapitulate where we left off, we're going to be using a Catholic theologian's definition, and we're doing it because we're not endorsing, Judaism, Christianity, or Islam, or Hinduism, or Buddhism over one another, and by exalting Christianity at the top. We're just doing it because it's generic, and all the definitions of God through each of these traditions agree with St. Anselm's definition. And he defined God as a maximally great being, which none greater is conceivable. Again, that's indispensable for our logic. And what he just said is that the proposition of God as a maximally great being, which none greater is conceivable, is self-evidently true, because he said that with close scrutiny, we'll see that any attempt to deny it results in a falsification of the concept. So what a self-evident truth is, it's a proposition, like I said, when any attempt to deny it inevitably results in some type of contradiction that causes the falsification of the very denial itself. And that, in turn, reveals that the proposition is undeniable. That's why we call it self-evident. And I'll give you a classic example of that. Let's take the objectivist axiom of existence exists. That's a self-evident proposition because whenever somebody attempts to deny that existence exists, the denial contradicts itself by its own mere existence, and that leaves the truth of the original proposition standing unchallenged. And this is exactly what Anselm meant when he said that God's existence is self-evident, because the existence of a maximally great being, which none greater can be conceived of, it's impossible to deny without contradicting oneself. And that means God's own existence is impossible to deny for reasons that we're soon going to see. And St. Anselm, he called this the ontological argument for the existence of God. And in order to show, here's how it works. We begin by defining God as a maximally great being, which none greater can be conceived. And when we do that, we're then forced to admit that it's impossible for us to say that God is imaginary, because it's possible for us to conceive of an even greater being than an imaginary God. And that's one that exists not only in the mind, but also in reality. And that means that the being that atheists call imaginary can't possibly be God, because God, by definition, is greater than what the imaginary being atheists mistake to be God actually is. In other words, they're attacking a self-contradictory, self-refuting misconception that's mistaken for the actual fact of God.
So with that said, is miracles, or are miracles considered imaginary, or is that proof in itself?
That in order for us to get involved in that's outside of the scope of the conversation. We need to establish the fundamental premises of what God is, and then extrapolate out from there.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Okay, definitely.
Okay. So, what Anselm did with his proof was that he demonstrated that the alleged justifications that atheists use, or that they propose for the existence of God, must be necessarily false. They propose for the non-existence of God. They said that they have to be necessarily false because they're all necessarily self-contradictory at their root. And as a result, all atheist criticisms of God aren't in fact applicable to God so much as their personal misconceptions that they're erroneously conflating to be God. And as a result, if all the justifications for denying the existence of God must logically contradict themselves, then atheism itself is necessarily incoherent, it's subsequently false. And that means if atheism itself is necessarily false, then the reality of God must therefore be true as a matter of logical necessity. And there's a lot of atheists who first hear this type of argument, they usually end up being like, that's fucking bullshit, they're just playing semantics to manipulate the language in ways that it confirms their own prejudices and their own biases. And there's a huge problem with that kind of argument, and it's that, and it's simply that, and it's that it's already been refuted. What most atheists aren't aware of is that the logic behind St. Anselm's ontological argument, it's already been proven true by Kurt Gödel. And just in case people don't know who Kurt Gödel is, he's the greatest logician of the 20th century. Because back in 1941, Gödel decided to test St. Anselm's ontological argument using modal logic, which is a form of mathematical reasoning that professional philosophers and scientists alike, they rely on to prove their hypotheses for errors and inconsistencies. And what Gödel himself discovered about St. Anselm's proof, namely that the logic was true, well, it disturbed him so deeply that he literally hid it away for the rest of his life, and because he didn't want his reputation being stigmatized by what he discovered, at least amongst his fellow academics. But after he died, which was in 1979, his proof turned up, and it turned up in his unpublished papers. And it really wouldn't be scientifically confirmed until well into the new millennium, when a group of scientists from Berlin's Free University, they collaborated with the Technical Institute of Vienna to analyze this proof. And what they discovered was that Gödel's proof was correct. St. Anselm's definition was right. Gödel had succeeded in logically proving St. Anselm's definition to be self-evidently true. And for people who deny it, the results of that work, they're published on archive.org. It's spelled arxiv.org. And it's called The Formalization, Mechanization, and Automation of Gödel's Proof of the Existence of God. So, having established St. Anselm's definition of God as self-evidently true, I just want to go ahead, I want to advance the argument of God's existence deeper into the archetypal continuum of the subject by introducing a primal mode of cognition to mediate between the subjective perspective and the first dimension of the phenomena. You ready?
Definitely, absolutely.
Okay. So in other words, what I want to do now is I just want to introduce what I call my deontological argument for the existence of God, so that I can demonstrate the various proofs that validated it. And the argument itself, it's simple, it's easy enough, and it follows like this. But first, it follows a form of logical argument that logicians and philosophers refer to as a syllogism. And for those of your listeners who aren't aware of what a syllogism is, it's a kind of argument that consists of two statements called major and minor premises that have been previously established to be true without exception, so that when they're deduced together to produce a conclusion, the conclusion is necessarily true because it consists of nothing more or nothing less than the sum of its major and minor premises. So here's how my deontological argument goes. We're going to take for our first premise this. 1. God by definition is a maximally great being which none greater is conceivable. 2. Existence itself, in fact, is a maximally great being which none greater is conceivable. 3. Therefore, God, by definition, is in fact existence itself. Let me say that one more time. God, by definition, is a maximally great being which none greater is conceivable. Existence itself is a maximally great being, which none greater is conceivable. Therefore, God, by definition, is in fact existence itself. Now, that's the deontological argument stated as succinctly and as concisely as it can, and it's difficult to explain how powerful this argument actually is. In fact, I consider it the most powerful argument for the existence of God ever formulated. Here's why. First, not only are the premises it relies on infallible in the sense that they're easily self-evidently true statements, and not only is the logic of the syllogism just airtight, but the conclusions it produces, insofar as it consists of nothing more than the content of the two self-evident premises, the conclusion itself is a self-evident conclusion where any attempt to deny it requires that the individual argue against the existence of existence itself. As a result, any attempt to deny the conclusion results in the denial itself immediately transubstantiating, on pain of self-contradiction, into a confirmation of the truth of the conclusion. So in other words, my deontological argument for the existence of God, it doesn't really just demonstrate Anselm's definition of God to be self-evident, but it even demonstrates that God's existence is identical with existence itself, and that any attempt to deny the existence of God is equal to denying the existence of existence. As a result, God's existence becomes impossible to deny. But what about proof? Is it possible to prove this argument true? Yes, unequivocally. Absolutely it is. Here's how. All we need to prove the argument true is to rewrite the syllogism in a different notational form that uses a different pattern of inference than the original argument. And to do this, all we need to do is take the conclusion of the deontological argument, and then we load it into the first premise, into what's called a disjunctive syllogism, and then load into it the second premise, a statement whose truth is logically contingent on the truth of the first premise. After that, all that's left for us to do is to infer the major and minor premises, or to infer from them another conclusion that's a coherent product of the major and minor premises. So let's just present the logical proof of the disjunctive syllogism. And it goes like this. If anything is empirically observable to exist at all, then God, therefore, is likewise observed to exist as the very existence inherent in that which is observed to exist. But something can be empirically observed to exist. For example, the existence of arguments which attempt to deny the truth of God's existence. Therefore, God is empirically observed to exist as the very existence inherent in such things as arguments that attempt to deny the truth of God's existence. So, in other words, as predicated by the deontological argument, the conclusion of this kind of disjunctive syllogism is the same as that of the deontological argument. The deontological argument is subsequently confirmed to be true in that sense. But again, what I've discovered is that an overwhelming majority of cases where I present atheists with these kinds of logical arguments for the existence of God, they almost always respond by admitting that the arguments themselves are sound, but that arguments alone can't be used to prove anything. However, what atheists don't recognize is that if arguments can't be used to prove anything true, then the atheists themselves can't make a counter-argument to the deontological argument. And not only can they make a counter-argument against the deontological argument, but they can't make an argument for themselves to justify their own skepticism. So if they deny that proof can be known through argumentation, then they themselves deny that they can argue themselves into a position that supports their own view. So, in other words, just as the deontological argument predicts, we'll always discover that every attempt to deny the truth of the proposition so that we can affirm the reality of atheism must always result in some kind of self-refuting logical contradiction. And the only question left is it possible to prove this prediction, which is made by my deontological argument? In other words, is it possible to extrapolate from the deontological argument a written proof that shows precisely why atheism must always refute itself when attempting to deny its conclusions? And again, the answer is yes. You see, there's a common fallacy which is circulating among atheists, which it really began with Victor Stenger, and it's the attempt to redefine atheism as the absence of a belief in God. Now, the problem with this definition is that it violates a premier law of logic, which is namely the law of identity. Now, this law explicitly forbids that concepts be defined in terms of what they're not, specifically because such efforts, they inexorably lead to absurdities. So, all right, for example, if we simply say that atheism is the condition of being absent of belief in God, then it kind of requires us to believe that rocks are also philosophically committed atheists, because rocks also are absent of belief in the existence of God. And that's what's called a reductio ad absurdum. In other words, it reduces to a self-contradictory absurdity. And it's precisely this contradiction which demonstrates why atheists who insist on defining atheism as an absence of a belief in God are proven wrong. Rather, if atheism is to be defined at all, then it must be positively defined. Otherwise, it's not possible to verify as either true or false.
Okay, in simplistic terms, from my end of things, I guess the proof of God in itself is just by looking at everything that you see. And that in itself is an extension of what God is, right?
God is existence itself.
It's existence, absolutely.
God is existence itself, right? And one way how we could use that existence itself to formulate a rebuttal to atheism and subsequently falsify it is by formulating, again, another form of syllogistic argument against it that reaffirms the validity of the deontological argument. We could put it like this. 1, atheism is the belief that God doesn't exist, okay? 2, God, the definition of which is a maximally great being, which none greater is conceivable, is identical with existence itself. 3, atheism, in denying the existence of God, therefore denies the existence of existence itself. But 4, but atheism does exist. Atheism itself exists. 5, therefore the mere existence of atheism, insofar as it logically presupposes the existence of existence itself, and therefore God itself, as the basis of its own existence, falsifies itself. And with the falsification of atheism, that's identical to the abductive proof of God's existence, which is predicated by the deontological argument. And 7, so God therefore is proven to exist. And that's really that's a logical argument for it. So we can sum up the findings and by just simply saying that the structure of the deontological argument, it uses something what Aristotle called a perfect syllogism, meaning that its pattern of inference from premises to conclusions, it's logically infallible. So much so that any attempt to deny as much as a denial of the structural foundation of the logic itself results in the denial of the very logic that one's own denial depends on. And because the premises of this deontological argument can't be denied without resulting in a self-contradiction, that means the premises of the deontological argument are themselves self-evident propositions, which are as close to infallible as the laws of logic permit. But even more importantly, insofar as the conclusion itself consists of no more than the sum of 2 self-evident premises, then the conclusion itself is likewise to be impossible to deny. So in summary, the deontological argument for the existence of God is nothing less than as powerful an argument in philosophy and science as can be made for the existence of God. In fact, it's even stronger than the cosmological argument used by philosophers such as Neil Turek and William Craig. That's how powerful it is. So that summarizes, so in a nutshell, what we've done is that we've just summarized the logical proof in the existence of God from the subjective perspective of the archetypal continuum. That's one dimension we've just covered for presenting the information in support of the existence of God. Do you want to throw anything else in before I progress?
Actually, not at this point. I'm just interested in what the next step is going to be.
Okay. So we've answered that question, and it's a question of whether or not belief in God can be logically proven true. And again, the answer is absolutely. The time's come now. The time, at least in my opinion, it's time to challenge the belief by attempting to test how rational the belief is. Now, you're probably noticing that I'm using logical and rational as if they mean 2 different things. And if you did, then you're right. That's because for philosophers, logical and rational do mean 2 different things, because they are different things. For philosophers, a belief is considered logical if the arguments in support of that belief are themselves logically justified to be true. However, the belief isn't considered rational until it's demonstrated that it has the power to explain a wide variety of observations from a perspective in a way that makes order within life and other things comprehensible to us. In other words, if a belief has the power to expand the ratio of human understanding, then the belief is considered rational. Ratio, rational. That's the relationship between them. And it just so happens that beliefs that are logical also tend to be rational, which is why laymen so easily confuse the terms. But let's make a transition from the subjective perspective to the adjective point of view of the topic, because it's here we can analyze the cosmological implications of God's existence. This way we'll be able to assess if the idea of God's existence has the power to broaden the ratio of human understanding, and in a way that encompasses the mysteries that are sort of impossible to solve without this idea. And the mystery we're now going to try to at least illuminate is the fact that within the last 5 decades, a growing number of cosmologists, they've been growing increasingly uneasy after making a series of most disturbing observations about the universe. And what they've discovered is that all the mathematical parameters which determine the strength of the laws of nature have virtually zero ability to be any different than what they are, without life in the universe being completely impossible. So in other words, if Boltzmann's constant was any different by more than a hair's breadth, then biological evolution is impossible. And if the speed of light in a vacuum were any different by more than a hair's breadth, then evolution itself is impossible. Or if heart rate energy were any different by more than a hair's breadth, then again we're faced with the same kind of problem. Evolution is impossible. In fact, if any one of the approximately 200 other variables were weaker or stronger by ratios really smaller than the breadth of an atomic nucleus, then the universe fails to self-organize long before evolution can come into existence to beget life. So if you're not grasping this, let me just say this as bluntly as I can. There's about 200 physical parameters that astrophysicists use to describe the strength of the laws of nature. And if you change any one of them by virtually any measurable amount, the universe fails before life can evolve. And there's a name for this, and scientists call it the problem of fine-tuning. And for cosmologists and astrophysicists, it's the most perplexing enigma in all of science today. All right, point in case. Physicists represent the strength of gravity using a mathematical value known as the gravitational constant. And if that value was any different by just 1 part in 10 followed by 60 zeros, then guess what? Either the universe expands so quickly that it vaporizes long before planets could form to harbor life, or the universe implodes into itself long before any planets could form for all life to evolve. And in another case, if we look at the rate of cosmic inflation, then we see really the same thing. If the mathematical value called the cosmological constant were different by virtually any measurable degree, then the cosmos itself would have expanded so rapidly that it would have been impossible for galaxies to form, and therefore impossible for life to evolve, or everything that depends on them. And at the same time, if it were different in the other direction, everything would have started clumping together before any stable star systems with planets could form to allow life to evolve. So again, there are 200 other variables beyond the ones I'm mentioning here that demonstrate the same problem. And if any of these variables were different by virtually any significantly measurable degree, then guess what? Planets stable enough to support life never come into existence, let alone one stable enough to allow for the evolution of things. Now, I want you to keep in mind that what I'm saying is accepted by virtually every major cosmologist and astrophysicist alive today that's working in the field. It's an uncontroversial, unchallenged fact. Ask any cosmologist, call them up at a university, ask them about it. Ask any cosmologist or astrophysicist, and they'll tell you that everything I just said is unequivocally the case. And this is an issue that disturbs a ton of physicists that are working in the field, because so far there's only 3 ways available for scientists to interpret this. Now, some scientists tried to say that the existence of a life-permitting universe is unavoidable and it's logically necessary. However, the idea of a determinate universe that's capable of supporting evolutionary biology, that violates a known law of physics called Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. And this is the principle of quantum mechanics that states that all universes are governed from their infancies by statistical probabilities and not by predetermined specific laws. In other words, there's a law of nature that prohibits universes predetermined to be hospitable to evolutionary biology, and hence, the appearance of life. Now, another recourse to the problem of fine-tuning is for scientists to just dismiss it as a coincidence. Now, the problem with such an appeal to serendipity, if we want to use the term, is that the mathematical odds involved in scoring such a lucky break is like playing the lotto with as many ping-pong balls as there are atoms in the observable universe. And out of all those atoms, you have just one chance, only one, to guess what the lucky ping-pong ball is to produce life. Do you know what the odds of that are? I'm going to tell you what they are. Physicist Fred Hoyle, he calculated them. And he found that the odds of such a thing happening are 1 in 10 to the 500th power. In fact, he said that there's actually a higher likelihood of a jet airplane self-assembling during a storm from debris sucked up from a scrapyard in a tornado than it is from a universe like ours self-assembling from total chaos into a unified cosmology, complete with ecologies and civilizations and organisms that are really capable of contemplating what the odds of this all coming into being actually are. And that's why Hoyle, when he says that, he says chalking things up to dumb luck is simply out of the question. Now, this is the part where many scientists, they start to get a little dodgy when trying to skirt the theological implications that are obviously built into the laws of nature. So much so that an increasing number of physicists are straight out abandoning the scientific method by proposing hypotheses to explain why the universe appears to be finely tuned. And these hypotheses, they're not, in many cases, they're not observable, they're not measurable, they're not science, in my opinion. And the reason many physicists are resorting to such extreme measures is to avoid having to admit that the best explanation we have for why the cosmos appears exactly as it would be if it were finely tuned is because the universe actually is finely tuned and is done to allow for the evolution of life. Now, to date, the reigning hypothesis that scientists propose in order to avoid the theological implications of this problem of fine-tuning, it's one called the multiverse hypothesis, and here's how it works. It's easy enough to understand. Now, according to those who formulated the hypothesis, our universe is only one in an endless ocean of quantum fluctuations, each with their own unique physical parameters. And all these universes, they say, are effervescing like carbon bubbles in champagne within an infinite vacuum. And the idea is that, given enough time, it's inevitable that some universe will eventually appear with all the parameters necessary for supporting life. And since we're here, we shouldn't be surprised to learn that the universe that supports us appears to be finely tuned specifically for us. And at first glance, this type of argument seems plausible, but a deeper look at it reveals several flaws in the logical justifications behind the simple fact of it. Foremost of which is it's a classic example of the gambler's fallacy, which is the error of thinking that if something happens more frequently over time, then it's more likely to get a certain result over time. In another sense, there's something else which is wrong with it, such as it simply begs the question. In other words, let's put it this way. Paul Davies or Bernard Heisch will tell you, they're both physicists, Paul Davies and Bernard Heisch will both tell you that physicists have found that such a multiverse requires far more fine-tuning than even our own universe. Far more fine-tuning. So, rather, the real problem, according to physicists like Davies, is that if the multiverse hypothesis is true, then there should be some universes with life which is complex enough to build computers powerful enough to simulate an endless number of universes, so that it's far more likely that we exist in a simulated universe than a natural one. And hence, if that's the case, we have virtually no reason whatsoever to believe that we live in a multiverse. Now, the power of this argument is utterly damning in its ability to demonstrate the logical incoherence of the multiverse hypothesis. However, for atheists who believe in the multiverse hypothesis over really the argument of fine-tuning, the situation gets increasingly worse. Because in 2006, a research experiment performed by an Iranian physicist, his name was Shahriar Afshar, he falsified the many worlds hypothesis outright with the experimental outcome of that. So Paul Davies' argument isn't simply adding insult to injury, but it's really substantiated even by the experimental data. But really, what about the simulation hypothesis? Like, for real, isn't it at least just as plausible that the reason the universe is finely tuned is because we do live in one of the many simulations which might have been designed by a super intelligent race of aliens?
Right.
Yeah. Again, according to the principle of Occam's razor, which states that causes should never be multiplied beyond necessity, the answer is no. Because even if we surmise as much, we're still left with the question of how their universes came into being, which can't be due to necessity or dumb luck or a multiverse hypothesis. In other words, we'd still be left again with the problem of fine-tuning for their universe.
Now just backtracking just a little bit.
Sure.
If we were to basically put on the table and to define the fact that God is existence, and knowing things within the realms of quantum theory and energy, would that equate to energy as well? That God is existence, and it equates to the existence of energy. If that's the case, then
let me just simplify it for you. Let me just simplify it for you and tell you what all of this means, so I can condense it. Okay.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Here's what this means for us. Because there's a law of physics that mechanically prohibits the origin of our finely tuned universe from being a function of determinism, and because all attempts to explain away this problem of fine tuning by appealing to statistical inevitability, all these are found incoherent, then in light of the falsification of both the multiverse hypothesis and the refutation of the simulation hypothesis, there's only one real solution. It means that if the universe isn't a function of causal necessity, and if the universe isn't a function of statistical inevitability, then the only real recourse we have for explaining the problem is to concede that the best hypothesis we have for explaining why the universe appears to be finely tuned is because it is finely tuned for the existence of life. In other words, there are no viable alternatives to the hypothesis that something outside of space and time intentionally set the initial conditions of the universe in such a manner as to result in the biological evolution of conscious life. So how is that possible? To answer this, we're going to have to cite some research. It's actually the research of a scientist at the New York Times. They credit him as one of the 3 greatest living scientists alive. That's a redundancy if I've ever heard him, but you get it. His name is Dr. Robert Lanza, and he believes that the reason the universe is, in all likelihood, inundated, saturated with life, is due to the fact that the very existence of the universe depends on the existence of life. And he says this is all because of a phenomenon in quantum mechanics that physicists refer to as the observer effect. Right. So to understand what we're going to have to understand this, we're going to travel back in time to 1901, because that's when the great German physicist Max Planck was first confronted by the insanely odd results of a simple experiment performed by another physicist named Thomas Young. And today we call it the dual slit experiment. And what this test revealed was that whenever light is a particle, that light is only a particle for as long as it's being observed. And however, the moment light stops being observed, then the light changes its forms and becomes a wave, exactly as it had in James Clerk Maxwell's research. But after struggling fiendishly to explain how it's impossible for light to respond to conscious observers, the only solution Planck could produce was to concede that matter doesn't really exist in any coherent sense so long as it's not being observed. So, again, what Planck discovered was, for as long as the material universe isn't being observed, then all that can be said to exist are mathematical clouds of possibilities that required conscious observers to actualize them into the appearance of coherent, physically real material realities. So according to Dr.
What you're describing as being real and existing in comparison to God is awareness and consciousness.
Right. Consciousness alone is existence. That's what we're getting at. And that's what Dr. Lanza is driving at. Dr. Lanza is driving that this is the enigma that physicists like Fred Kuttner and Bruce Rosenblum refer to is, in fact, the secret to coding why our universe appears to be so finely tuned. And the reason is, it's really astonishing. It's because all universes without physical parameters to evolve conscious observers to witness them are impossible. As a result, the only universes that can exist are ones which are outfitted with all the physical parameters necessary to allow for the biological evolution of conscious life. Now, I know, crazy. Now, just in case you don't understand me, I'm going to say it one more time because that's how important this is. Only universes that are outfitted with all the parameters necessary to support the biological evolution of conscious observers are physically possible. And it's for this reason that guys like Robert Lanza have signed on with the theory of biocentrism. That's what it's called, because according to him, biocentrism is really fundamental to understanding reality. As a matter of fact, it's not possible to rationally account for the existence of the universe without including a non-locally distributed phenomenon of cosmic consciousness permeating reality to observe the universe into existence. Nor is it permissible for such a non-locally distributed cosmic superconsciousness to observe a universe unless it's outfitted with all the physical parameters which are necessary to support its physical existence as a conscious observer, which is exactly why the universe appears to be so finely tuned. That's why, because consciousness dictates the possibility. The possibility of existence are consciousness contingent. So, in a summary, we've thus far demonstrated that belief in cosmic superconsciousness that are called God by virtually all the world's major religious traditions, it's not just perfectly logical from a subjective perspective, but we've also demonstrated that the belief is rational, so much so that the universe we live in isn't actually possible to account for without appealing to it. Now, the next question we have to ask ourselves is, what empirical evidence do we have to substantiate the existence of such a cosmic superconsciousness? The answer to this question, it comes from the research of a Hungarian physicist. His name is Ervin Laszlo. He's a philosopher. He's a systems theorist. The guy's got 4 PhDs. I know. In 2004, Dr. Laszlo, he published an overview of the most cutting-edge scientific research that was available to him at that time concerning his discovery that the quantum vacuum of empty space was, in fact, a living field of pure consciousness that operates in the form of a cosmic memory field navigating the developmental trajectory of the evolution of the universe. Scientists call this cosmic memory field by the name of the zero-point field, and Laszlo discovered that this zero-point field precisely has an uncanny resemblance to the Hindu concept of the Akasha, which Hindus said is the spiritual sky from which all things emerge. And most fittingly, the name of Laszlo's text, it's called Science in the Akashic Field, an integral theory of everything, that's where he published the research. And in it, Laszlo lays out the evidence to substantiate the claim that what physicists call the zero-point field is, in fact, it's nothing less than a cosmic superconsciousness that's ultimately accountable for the fine-tuning of the universe. In other words, scientists have literally discovered God. And the theory behind this is easy enough to explain, and begins with an analogy. So let's just imagine a grandfather clock for a second. It's the magical grandfather clock. And let's just endow it with the attribute that every time the pendulum swings, it shrinks by one exponent of itself, one factor of itself. If we unplugged the grandfather clock at the apex of its swing, how long would it be before the pendulum finally became perfectly still as it shrunk by a factor of itself? Well, the answer is that it would never stop swinging, because before the pendulum could slow down, the clock itself would be smaller than an atom. And at that level, it would be immersed in a sea of bubbling and boiling information and energy, which is really all that exists. Because when I say God is existence itself, that's what it is, the boiling sea of information and energy. And at that level, the clock's pendulum would always exhibit this residual jiggle that eternally powers it throughout all time. It's a quantum pond in which it exists.
Okay, before we get any further, here's a question for you.
Sure.
Does God arise from the Akasha, or does the Akasha arise from God? And is the universe God? Of course, the universe is God. Thus the whole explanation of the observer effect, which literally extends out to all of us, because since we observe this known universe, and the universe in itself cannot exist without us observing it, we are essentially gods in itself, right?
Well, I would object to the plural, because at the level of the zero-point field, there are multiple things cease to exist. There's only one unity, one reality. There's no such thing as a plurality at that scale. But the quantum flux, the zero-point field, what Ervin Laszlo calls it, the Akashic field, that would be the scientific discovery of God. It's substantiated. We've made the observation.
Here's how memory of God.
Here's how this works. So if we imagine kind of like a quantum pond, okay? And you're looking at a pond, the surface of it is perfectly still. And you're watching a boat, which is just sort of plying the water and it's moving forward, and it leaves all these information, all these wake trails behind it. If you had sufficiently advanced observational technology, you'd be able to look at this information, and you'd be able to know how much the boat itself weighed, the speed it was going, with its point of departure, approximately at what time it departed because of the speed ratios. You'd also be able to, even if the pond was smooth enough, you'd also be able to see the part to which the navigator of the boat reaches over and he grabs a beer out of his cooler, because that subtle rocking would be reflected in the pond. In other words, all the information of the historical event itself is coded in the surface of the water. And if nothing existed outside to cancel those interference patterns out, they would remain there indefinitely for all time. Similarly, just that's the case with our own cosmos. Nothing exists really outside of the zero-point field to cancel the interference patterns out. So everything that happens gets permanently recorded in the zero-point field forever in the form of interference patterns. And the interference patterns create an information buildup. And it's the information buildup that Laszlo, in his theory, states that it guides the evolution of future universes into that increasingly complexifying narrow range of physical parameters that make life possible. Now, according to Dr. Laszlo's research, again, the discovery of the zero-point field doesn't just refute the idea of the multiverse, but instead it substantiates an alternative hypothesis that we actually exist in a metaverse, where the quantum vacuum of space and time, they operate as a kind of cosmic memory field that memorizes the history of everything that's ever happened, like I said, in a form of interference patterns, which it then uses in a manner that pilot waves can be used to steer remote control cars to guide the evolution of the universe along its developmental trajectory towards a fuller realization of the potentials within it. Or in other words, it's not enough to say that belief in a cosmic superconsciousness is historically recognized as God, is logically self-evident from really a subjective perspective, nor is it even rationally necessary from an objective perspective. But it's also true that the existence of such a cosmic superconsciousness has, in fact, been empirically substantiated to objectively exist, at least by really the most cutting-edge research in the field of vacuum physics. And that scientists know it as the zero-point field. So we have logical evidence, which seals the deal and demonstrates, which proves it true. Belief in God is logically necessary and categorically undeniable. The universe itself is impossible to explain without appealing to the existence of cosmic superconsciousness. So the belief itself is rational in terms of it clarifying our understanding of the cosmos, and the belief itself is empirically substantiated by the discovery of the zero-point field. That's what's really important.
Now is the superconsciousness, which is equivalent to the 0 point, is that what many experience when they get into Samadhi, in the deeper consciousness, in the meditative state?
You're moving exactly in the right direction. You're moving exactly in the right direction, because really the only question that remains for us is, how is it possible for people to verify for themselves belief in God? How is it possible for us to to verify belief in God for ourselves? And that, in other words, that requires altered states of consciousness. Because, in other words, what steps can we take to personally verify God's existence? Now, according to the scientist Thomas Kuhn, who's the man who conceived in the modern understanding of our word for paradigm, knowledge isn't just laying around in the world like rocks, waiting for us to pick it up and install it into our brains like software applications. Kuhn says that all knowledge, even scientific knowledge, is paradigm contingent. Now, all this means is that our ability to even recognize what we call knowledge as knowledge, it actually depends on what paradigm we're approaching our observations from in order to interpret our findings. And what he said beyond this is that the very act of verifying one interpretation of an observation over another depends entirely on a very specific process that follows a series of steps in order to produce an observation consistent with one's interpretation. And the term for this series of steps to be followed, the term for this he called an injunction. Now, in order for our knowledge to qualify as knowledge, then the observations it depends on, they need to be produced by a valid injunction. In order for an injunction to be considered valid, then it's critical that it meets several criteria. The very first criteria is that using the principles of the paradigm itself, we have to be able to predict the experience we expect to have after following the injunction. That's the first thing that an injunction has to follow. After that, the second criteria is that we have to invent a series of steps that really anyone can follow to produce the data that we want to observe. However, there's a catch. And it's that every step in the process has to be designed in a way that confines the number of possible interpretations of the data to an extremely narrow range. And the reason why is obvious. It's to eliminate all possible interpretations of the data except the one that's being tested for. And after this, then once the injunction is followed and the data is produced and an observation is made, the next step is to eliminate the least plausible interpretations of the data until all that remains is an interpretation that is the most logically coherent explanation for what we're observing. And this is incredibly important, because if none of the possible explanations can explain the data, then we're in a position where we're kind of forced to reject the very paradigm that produced the data, and we have to begin to search for a new way of theorizing about such observations that are capable of better explaining what it is that we're experiencing. And last but not least, if in the event we do make an observation, and if our interpretation is wholly consistent with the data, then it's critical that the information that we've acquired, it gets passed along to a body of experts who are adequately educated on the topic to see if they can replicate the results. And again, here's the catch. There's nothing in science that says that such a scientific approach to seeking out knowledge can only be applied to outer physical realities. Again, let me repeat that. There's nothing in the scientific method that says this process could only be applied to outer physical realities. If that were the case, psychology itself wouldn't exist. Right. And what that means is that we can actually use this method to see for ourselves if God exists as kind of a function of the Akashic field. So now something here does need to be addressed before I explain how that's possible to verify God's existence. And it's bound to upset some people. And it's that this process is in no way, shape, or form a democratic one. Rather, the process itself isn't just strictly meritocratic, but it's downright elitist. And here's why I say this, and it's because the only people who are allowed to voice their opinions on the issue are the experts in the subject who've been trained to the point of being reliable, trustworthy observers. And I'll give you an example of that. Most people looking through a telescope, they have no clue what the fuck it is that they're looking at. In fact, there's an enormous amount of background information that an observer has to be totally fluent and conversant with before he can have the skill of reliably distinguishing what he or she is actually observing. And there's also an enormous amount of technical vernacular that he has to be fluent in order to be able to reliably and accurately describe what he or she sees to somebody else. And I'll give you an example of it. Let's just say, for the sake of argument, that I aim a telescope at Jupiter, and we have a Maasai warrior that's with us, and we have the Maasai warrior look through the scope. Now, if I were to ask him and what he sees, then he's probably going to tell me that he sees the belt buckle of a cosmic giant. And that's exactly the point that I'm driving at. It's that the process of making skillful and reliable observation requires a degree of standardized technical training to the point that these kinds of reports, to prevent these kinds of reports from muddying the waters of the research. Now, again, here's what this all means for atheists who might be listening, and it's that unless you've taken the steps for yourselves to access whether or not, or to access superconsciousness and to assess, to make an observation of whether or not God exists, that is, unless you familiarize yourself with the scientific and philosophical background knowledge to such a degree that were God to show up in your telescope, you know what you're looking at, then your opinion doesn't matter. You have to have the necessary education to not only recognize what exactly it is that you're looking at, but also to be able to describe it reliably in detail.
Right.
Otherwise, your participation in this discussion isn't allowed to be, and it's not. We can't take it seriously. We can't. So if an atheist lacks the background understanding, they lack the training, they lack an understanding of the principles which are involved, the philosophical, the spiritual principles which are involved, and they're not making an observation, their opinion is relevant. They can't be included in that. They don't know what if God were to show up in the telescope, they'd have no clue of even recognizing it.
Right.
That's right. And I'll give you an example of this, just to show they're not being biased. This is exactly what kind of happened when the Vatican looked through Galileo's telescope, and they tried to rule on Galileo's discovery of the moons of Jupiter, and they tried to say it was false. They didn't have the background knowledge to even recognize what they were looking at, and they attempted to pontificate that Galileo's observation was totally invalid. It's the same thing in the opposite direction. If you can't recognize God when he finally shows up in your microscope or your telescope, you have no business being allowed into the conversation to look through. Now, insofar as I can tell, the most powerful, scientifically compatible injunction devised for experiencing cosmic superconsciousness, it actually comes from a Hindu saint by the name of Patanjali, and he lived somewhere around the 11th century in India. Now, he left behind a text called the Yoga Sutras. In it, he describes an exact injunction that really anyone with the right background knowledge can walk through in order to experience cosmic superconsciousness, and therefore to have this first-hand encounter and know for themselves whether or not God exists. And he called these steps the 8 limbs of yoga. And by every litmus that I could assess, they satisfy the criteria for a scientific injunction precisely. So for any of you who are interested in experimentally verifying for yourselves whether or not this metanoetic paradigm in fact does constitute or verify God's existence, then this is how you do it. Step one for verifying whether or not God exists is something called yama, and this requires that you have to purify yourself from intellectual dishonesty by cultivating a character that abstains from lying, cheating, stealing, promiscuity, and sobriety, or hostility towards others. Because otherwise, if you don't, then you just might very well wind up confirming your own bias, really. Now, step 2 in the process is called niyama. Now, that means that you need to cultivate within yourself certain habits that empower you with the ability to be able to consistently produce the data in a trustworthy and a reliable way. In this case, it means cleanliness, it means contentment with life, it means austerity in the sense of simple living, it means the ability to honestly introspect on your own motivations, and finally submission to the truth, irrespective of its nature when it does show up. That's incredibly important. And after that comes step 3, which are asanas. Basically, this means you have to exercise to relax yourself in your muscles to some degree. And some people traditionally do yoga postures, but really any form of rigorous exercise will do as a preparation so that when you finally sit down in a comfortable space, you can let your nervous system simmer down so that you're ready to enter into a superconscious state. Because otherwise, if you're fidgeting with yourself, that could prevent you from getting still enough to enter into an altered state of consciousness, in which it's possible to experience cosmic superconsciousness. Now, the next step is called pranayama. And this means that you have to sit down and slow your breathing to a relaxed, rhythmic pace in order to give your brain all the oxygen it needs to make a smooth and seamless transition from ordinary consciousness into an altered state in which cosmic superconsciousness becomes possible. Then after that, there's pratyahara. Now, and what you have to do for this step is to fix your attention inwardly on the space between your eyes, right behind the wall of your skull. And this is the process of constantly sweeping any thoughts out of your mind that might pop up so you can focus solely on the experience of being conscious itself. And after pratyahara, then comes something called dharana. Now, during this stage, your mind will enter into a deep state of awareness that is utterly void of all images. Hindu Roshis describe it as the space between thoughts, with the purpose of pratyahara to be to expand the gap between thoughts as wide as possible, so that transmental, transrational observations of this kind of conscious field in our own experience, they become possible. And then once dharana has occurred, the next step in the process is called dhyana, and it's the most difficult step in the entire process. It often takes years of training to even recognize it during meditation. However, for those who do, they're instructed to simply wait in the space between thoughts, focusing exclusively on the void of all mental activity without making any judgments whatsoever until a flash of insight occurs in that space. That flash of insight is considered the eighth and final step of the process. It's called Samadhi. You mentioned it earlier. It is equated with the transcendent ground of all being. Sages of all religious persuasions have described Samadhi as being the experience of an infinite, eternal, primordial void of all images, all effigies, of which nothing could be positively said about it, in any direct sense beyond an overwhelming feeling of awe and awesomeness that impresses that person with an absolute sense of the divine presence beyond all rational comprehension. And there are a number of skeptics who hear this, and really some people are inclined to reject it simply because the process itself transcends rationality. They try to say it can't be trusted because how do you know you're not hallucinating? Anything else along the lines of that. What they don't know is that they're committing a logical fallacy called the pre-trance fallacy. First of all, in the absence of all thought, there's an absence of all hallucination. That can't be allowed to dismiss the experience. There are no thoughts, there are no images, there are no imaginings. So subsequently, you can't blame the experience on the hallucination. And the pre-trance fallacy, which they're making in this particular instance of trying to reject the authority of mystical experience, is they tend to basically take transrational experiences such as cosmic superconsciousness and lump it in with pre-rational experiences such as infantile wish fulfillment. And they tend to conflate the two of them and think one is the other, specifically because they both have the attribute of being non-rational. When in reality, like I said, there's pre-rational states and there's transrational states, and they're failing to disambiguate the two of them. Again, the reason why this is valid and that you can know this to be a authentically transrational state is because in the absence of thoughts, because remember, you're dwelling in the space between thoughts, you're also in the absence of imaginary musings, you're also in the absence of memories, you're also in the absence of any sort of psychological activity whatsoever. Whatever you encounter in that state can't be chalked up to any one of them. It eliminates the possibility. And then when you emerge from that state of cosmic superconsciousness, that's how you independently verify for yourself whether or not God exists.
So
in a nutshell,
a sense, my interpretation of this is that it's a sense of initiation to be like God. And once you are to see yourself in that way, it's a sense of self-mastery to kind of like getting to the depths of knowing thyself. And once you know thyself, is that where you essentially see God?
When you get into that state, you have an experience which utterly transcends all words and utterly transcends all concepts. It utterly transcends any way that you could attempt to try to logically describe the experience. That's why they call it a transrational experience.
And that's your evidence.
When you emerge from that experience, you have a different type of non-rational knowledge. You have a direct experience, a pure empirical experience, to which you go back, you revisit your various spiritual concepts and theological concepts to see what types of ideas best map onto this. Unequivocally, everyone who experiences this will tell you the closest term you'll ever come to applying to this reality will be God. It won't be a squirrel. It's not going to be a tree. It's not going to be a skyscraper. It's not going to be a relativity theory. It's not going to be like a quantum foam. It's not going to be anything remotely like that. Everybody who experiences this, even secularists who go through the process, will say the closest term that they have to explaining what it was that they encountered in that state is God. And that's where the conversation ends. So in summary, here's what we've done. I began the conversation from a subjective perspective on the archetypal continuum of the subject of God's existence. I demonstrated a logical argument that is lock, stock, and barrel, self-evidently true, and as close to infallible as logic will allow. Belief in God's existence is overwhelmingly justifiable logically, and it's proven true logically. Then I progressed from the subjective perspective into the adjective perspective of the existential matrix, which is context of the conversation. And by exploring the various different alternatives, such as chalking up to coincidence, determinism, or a multiverse hypothesis, we've discovered that the problem of fine-tuning the universe can only be explained were the logical proposition that we've preceded true. God exists, and God is the best explanation for the observation that we're making at a cosmological level in a rational context. In other words, belief in God is not only logical, it's also rational. It's almost indispensably rational, even, at least within the principles of biocentrism. After that, I've presented the physical evidence that empirically substantiates the logical, rational belief in the existence of God from a scientific perspective at the level of cutting-edge physics and hard science. Last but not least, I provided a series of injunctions that individuals can take for themselves after they've outfitted themselves with all the necessary background education that they need to make an observation, to perform for themselves so they could verify for themselves and have an experience of whether or not God exists. In other words, belief in God is logically justified. That logically justified belief and proven true belief is eminently rational. It's empirically substantiated. And last but not least, it's personally verifiable by any and all of us. That's as close to lock, stock, and barrel categorical knowledge that a human being can get regarding the existence of God. Those four different dimensions compiled together that way. That is how I can claim that I know that God exists. So when atheists say that there's no such thing as God, we can actually point to the Akashic field. We can point to the zero-point field. When they said there is no proof of the existence of God, we can point to the arguments presented as the subjective perspective of the existential matrix. When they say that God is not rational, we could point to the adjective perspective of the adjective perspective of the existential matrix. Previously I meant the subjective perspective of the archetypal continuum. But we could point to the adjective perspective, and we could demonstrate the rationality of that. And if they say God is not possible to verify personally, where is God? How come God doesn't show up? Why doesn't God just reveal himself? We could give them a means so that they can go ahead, they can see that for themselves. The argument basically, for all intents and purposes, is over. And so far as I can tell, there's no sounder argument than this fourfold meta-noetic analysis of the existence of God. That's it.
Absolutely a wonderful explanation and examination, and leading towards the evidence, which leads more to utmost faith into our existence, our examination and perception of the universe and everything that's happening. Now, my last question, okay,
sure.
And this is kind of like crossing the bridge or providing a connection between this information to what is actually happening right in front of us before our very eyes, that the cycle of things and how we see the worldview in multiple angles of things. So how are we to take this knowledge, this wisdom in knowing God? I got my own spin as far as this interpretation in connecting this particular wisdom and knowledge to how we are to take this information on forward. But according to you, okay, Mike Carrano, M.A. Carrano, author, spiritualist in many ways, experimental philosopher. How are we to take this information and to see what is going on right now as we speak, and to take this information and to empower ourselves to see this as a personification of the creative process, the existence of God?
So how can we apply this information creatively and usefully in the world?
Right.
The first thing that a person has to do is they're going to have to set out to have a religious experience themselves. First thing they're going to have to do is set out to have a religious experience themselves. So when people tell me that they're spiritual but not religious, I kind of hear that as someone saying that they're healthy, but they don't necessarily diet or exercise. Well, they're probably healthy for now, but for how long? So the first thing they need to do is they need to get serious about spiritual training. So they need to begin seriously committing themselves to a religious practice that brings their spirituality into it, because religion without spirituality is literally uninspired, meaning absent spirit. And spirituality without religion is undisciplined, it's unfocused, it's clumsy, it's ham-fisted, and ultimately it's not going to be able to indemnify you against sort of the onslaught of intellectual critique and challenges that it's going to be confronted with. So a person needs to bring their spirituality into a religious training. Now, the different religions which I advocate that do have mystical traditions which are involved with them, which are valid, would be Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism. Those are the big six. If a person is interested seriously in verifying this information, they need to begin seriously getting involved in a religious, spiritual practice. My advice is for them to go for the religious tradition that they like the least. And the reason being is because that's their ego's instinct of what a person feels most threatened by, what will be most effective for undoing it. So if a person has an aversion, let's say, to Judaism, but they have a deep love for, they have a deep love for Christianity, I advise them to go and convert to Judaism and then get involved in the Kabbalistic studies of the mystics and find yourself immersed in that tradition. You'll find your ego rapidly dissolved under that process. Now, once you have the experience, it's at that point that you'll know exactly how to integrate it into your life. This information has only rational pertinence for people who are struggling in the field of cosmology. But for a person who wants to go ahead and take this information and put it into practice, there needs to be an experiential basis for it. If a person doesn't have an experiential basis in some sort of enlightenment experience or some sort of mystical theosis or some sort of gnosis, it's going to be very difficult to apply it in a sensible way. They're going to need to let the rubber hit the road with an experience that justifies their rationality. But most importantly, they also, with one caveat, need to steer clear of fundamentalism. They need to steer clear of fundamentalism in their faith. They need to steer clear of the exclusive sort of thinking that tends to basically define an in-group against an out-group, because their spirituality needs to be flexible enough to always be adapting to expand to include other human beings as aspects of their sense of self. That's the best way I could describe it. Once they have that religious experience, once they have that spiritual experience, that enlightenment experience, that samadhi, that marabata, whatever it is they want to call it, then they'll know how to apply it. It will be overwhelmingly obvious.
Mike, thank you so much. In these times when we are looking for the light and looking for an explanation to things, I always tell people, especially with the fear-mongering that's so much out there within society, the global spectrum of things, I always tell myself and tell people, be perfectly clear in your place, in your perception of God and your relationship with God during these times. And I believe that this broadcast is going to be the doorway, the gatekeeper to allowing people to acknowledge that in consciousness. So with that said, Mike, thank you for being that light, and thank you for the person that you are. We need more and more people to awaken to the very place of who they are, and to walk into that position, that leverage where people like you are providing the pathway of that light for people to walk into their own place of being, from the Akasha of why they're here. And I believe it's all meant to be. And there's a great deal to learn from this. So thank you, Mike, for returning back to Quantum Mindfulness Radio.
Take care, boss. Thank you.
And there you have it. M.A. Carrano, Mike Carrano, the author of Asleep in the Helix, Survival and the Science of Self-Realization, an experimental philosopher and a systems analyst, and many, many other things. Do check out his book. Do check out his website. And I guarantee you will never, ever be the same. So thank you so much for tuning in to another inspiring episode of Quantum Mindfulness Radio.